Okay.
Perfect. I'll hand over to Owen.
Right. Okay. Evening, everyone, both of you. I will run through an overview of what we're going to cover before we then launch into it. I'm very happy, particularly as there's quite small numbers, to be interrupted, stopped as we go along, and try and answer any questions and queries as we go along. If you have anything, conscious that both of the people who are attending live are both quite experienced, if there's anything particular that you're hoping to get from today, maybe bung it in the chat as I make a start, and then we can try and address any particular specifics as well as do the general, which I will run through, especially for the benefit of people who have said they might want to watch this back as well, if you'll bear with me while I do that. Brilliant, thank you. So let's not do that because that's silly. We will be looking to just go over the basic concepts that we talk about. This is part of a wider series of stuff to improve our safeguarding practice as an organisation. So we'll just run over some basic concepts of safeguarding as well as thinking about assessing and managing risk in our activities. We'll look at what the minimum expectations are, what we're asking you to do as an organisation before you set out and do things with young people where they might get squished or otherwise injured. We will look at what the good practice is all about, the things we are promoting as the approach that we would like to see you adopt. And we will also look at where you can get additional support and advice. So just to remind everybody, when we talk about safeguarding and when we talk about child protection, when we talk about safeguarding, we're talking about a holistic approach to protecting children from maltreatment, to preventing anything that impairs their health or development, and making sure that they're growing up in the best circumstances possible and that they have the best outcomes that they can have. So assessing and managing the risks inherent in our activities clearly fits within that. What it is less to do with is that stuff around child protection, which is what people often think of when we say safeguarding and safeguarding training. So as a reminder, child protection is about that specific reactive stuff that we do to protect a specific child or children who we know are suffering or likely to suffer significant harm from something. That might be a referral to an outside agency, or it might be, putting them in an ambulance and getting their injury dealt with. Safeguarding describes that much wider approach, and what we're trying to do in that is keeping children physically and emotionally safe at all times when they're part of our activities. As a reminder, and I'll always come back to these on these sessions, central to our approach on and keeping our activities safe is making sure that you are always sharing any concerns that might be worries about an individual child, that might be somebody behaving inappropriately, or it might be volunteers consistently ignoring our policies and procedures and running activities that you think are safe or unsafe. You should always be sharing those concerns, usually with your local safeguarding lead. If you're not able for any reason to share with your local safeguarding lead, I would share those with your group coordinator. If you can't share them with your group coordinator, or you are the group coordinator, then you should give me a call, and I or another of the safeguarding team will respond and advise. Again, just to cover the same stuff that we will always come back to in these sessions. If there's a child or young person in immediate danger, your recourse is to call the police. Call 999. Not necessarily because a crime has been committed, but because they are the people who can remove a child immediately to a place of safety. Everything else, your local safeguarding lead, who will talk to me or another of the team and determine the next steps. So that's the wider setting in which we're operating. When we're talking about managing risk, we're talking about balancing the risks that are inherent in everything we do. It is dangerous to leave your house. It is dangerous to stay at home. Everything has risks associated with it. Yeah. But we do stuff because there are benefits associated with the stuff that we might do. We're looking at identifying what those risks are and how we might control them. We're looking at recording and sharing the outcomes of that discussion that we've got, putting it into practice, and then reviewing our approach as time goes on and we learn more about what can go wrong or what can go right. For our activities or anything we do that you're expecting Woodcraft folk to be responsible for, accountable for, you're expecting our insurers to cover you for, there must be a risk assessment in place for any activity that we do. It is perfectly sufficient to have a standard risk assessment that covers your normal range of activities in your normal venue. My risk assessment for my group covers crafts and games and use of the kitchen and cooking and using sharp tools for doing bushcrafty things inside in our normal hall that we use, and all the associated risks with that. Anything else, we will do a specific risk assessment for the activity if it's riskier. So we're doing fire lighting or something like that in an outdoor venue. And for the summer, when we probably shift and do most of our sessions in the park, we'll have a standard risk assessment for running around in that park, where we might be working in a slightly different way. The children might not always be in our line of sight, and so on and so forth. You should do a risk assessment separately for every camp or residential trip, or a day trip to somewhere you've not been before. It should be shared with all the leaders and helpers and volunteers who are supporting that. And it should be consistent with the local safeguarding plan that you have agreed as a group or as a district, which covers that thing about how you translate the national policy, which says we will keep children and young people safe by doing all this stuff, into what you actually do on your group night in that session, how you record their attendance, how you hand them over to parents at the end of the session, all of those things. Okay. As I said before, if we wanted to eliminate all risk from our activities, we would just roll down the shutters and give up, because there is risk inherent in everything that we do. What we're doing as youth workers, what we're doing as Woodcraft folk leaders, is constantly balancing the risks and benefits. And the HSE, it's easy to sort of talk about the Health and Safety Executive as the demons in all of this, but they're actually pretty pragmatic and pretty on the ball. They deal with risk all day, every day. That's what they do. And they've got an approach that's perhaps not the one that they're caricatured as having sometimes. The chair of the HSE said in a forward to this very handy little guide that Andy, our former head of centres, pointed us towards, about nothing ventured. If the next generation enter the workplace, having been protected from all risk, they will not be so much risk averse as completely risk naive. Exposing our children and young people, our young members, to some level of risk that they can carefully control and manage and learn to assess for themselves is an important part of the learning that they do when they're at Woodcraft folk and when they're entering the world. Sometimes learning to manage risk and keep yourself safe and spot the risks for yourself and keep the other people you're working with safe and function as part of a functional community is as much of a learning outcome from coming to Woodcraft and doing an activity as the learning the skill that you happen to be developing, the rational outcome, if you like, of that session. It's important to bear that in mind. Our friends at Girl Guiding did a report in 2009, which again stated that stuff around needing to balance risk and fear of risk. Over-anxious adults, exaggerated media coverage, and the inconsistent application of rules supposedly designed to keep girls safe have contributed to a climate of worry and misinformation. As a result, many girls and young women are more concerned about statistically unlikely scenarios than genuine risks to their well-being. And we'll come on to that a bit later. But yeah, obviously Girl Guiding, focusing their activities on girls and young women, are very conscious of the impact of over-anxious adults, over-anxious parents in particular, and scare stories in the media, rather than a realistic assessment of the things that are going to be a risk to well-being. So if you look at the risks that are inherent in the activities that we do, some of them will be environmental. They will be to do with the place that you happen to be doing it. They will be to do with the nature of the activity. They'll be to do with the needs or experience or lack of experience of the participants and their interactions with each other. They could similarly be to do with the leader's needs and experience or lack of it. Or there could be external factors, weather, public, animals, anything else that you can't directly control when you're leading the activity. It's worth thinking about when we're looking at risks. If you're going, have we got everything? Have we got everything? Just run through those categories. And have we thought about all the risks that are environmental? It's a helpful sort of aid memoir. I don't suggest you need to break your thing down into 5 sections, but just to kind of check, it's quite a useful thing to make sure you've thought about all the obvious things. You might have come across this before. There is an idea when we come to reducing and minimizing risk of a hierarchy of control, and simple terms: elimination, substitution, physical controls, administrative controls, and protective equipment. The idea is that it is most effective if you can eliminate the risk, the thing that's causing the hazard, just not do it. And so it goes down, and the least effective thing is putting effectively a flimsy piece of plastic between you and the thing that's causing the hazard. That's not a hard and fast rule, and actually sometimes eliminating the hazard completely won't be effective. I'm not saying that you shouldn't wear protective equipment when you go rock climbing, for example, because it's not effective. Clearly it is, but in terms of control, an effective way of controlling the risk, you would be much better in many cases to not do the activity at all. But that's where the balancing act comes in. If you didn't do rock climbing at all, then you would not gain any of the benefits of that sense of achievement and that teamwork and that sense of putting yourself in the hands of others when they're belaying for you and all of those things. Those are the things that we're trying to get our young people to experience and to learn from doing that activity. So eliminating it would eliminate not just the risk, but also the benefit.
Any benefits?
But we would have some physical controls, and we would have some administrative controls, and we would have some protective equipment. And we wouldn't do an activity like rock climbing without that. And if we did it without those things in place, we would rightly be taken to the cleaners. So, thinking about a very simple activity, this is one of my, well, she's a pioneer now, but she was an elfin at the time, doing an activity in our local pocket park, making little jam jar lanterns with candles in them. They were real candles. There was fire. There was definite risk there. What could we have done? We could have not done the activity at all. We could have done something else, or we could have made the lanterns and we could have not put a light in them. Or we could have substituted. We could have used a little LED candle, for example, but we didn't do that. We could have put physical control. So we could have said, well, the children aren't going to put it in there. Only the adults going to put it in there and light it. And do you know what? That's what we did. Because it wasn't appropriate for 6- and 7-year-olds to be fiddling around with matches and jam jars and things like that. But I can do it relatively safely. So that's what we did. We could have done administrative control. So we could have thought about a different way of doing that. So we would have done one-to-one supervision and very, very carefully done it, but it would have taken ages. Or we could have made them all wear asbestos gloves, and then they would have dropped the candles everywhere, and it all would have gone horribly wrong. So there's an example of the different controls that you could put, and actually working out which one is the most appropriate to use in that sense. And just a little word example. Again, from our friends at the HSE, you're not trying, when you assess risk, to eliminate everything. You're looking to manage it. You're looking to strike the balance. But, and this is the bit I like, it does not mean that every aspect of play provision must be set out in copious paperwork as part of a misguided security blanket. That's not what the HSE are expecting. That's not what our insurers are saying. A quick, easy to understand standing risk assessment that covers most of the likely eventualities in a way that everyone can understand is absolutely the right way to go. It is a proportional response. Sometimes there is a feeling that the risk assessment is something that we give to the group leader and they just go away and do it. Actually, the most effective assessment of risk is where you include everybody who's going to be part of it in the activity, and in the conversation. The conversation is the outcome. The risk assessment on a piece of paper is the record of that. It's important for a paper trail. It's important for reference, but it's effectively just the minutes of the meeting that other people have participated in. As a minimum, it needs to at least be seen and understood by everybody. Now, I would normally send it to the volunteers who are helping with the activity, support the activity. I would normally share it with young people orally by saying, and now children, when we do this and when we do this and when we cross the road, we're going to do it like that and so on. And I would always check with them for comprehension. You should be looking at what is the risk and who is at risk of that, and then talking about what you're going to do about it. And as you know, realistically, we're not going to be writing this every single week. We're going to have a standing risk assessment for most of our normal activities. It's really important that you do go back and revise it and update it every now and again. So a record of who completed it and when is really important as well. We are not expected to assess the risk of the impact of risks that are either trivial or fanciful. Sometimes, particularly people who've done these in workplaces and in schools and so on, will be used to putting a rank of, how high is it, how severe is it, how likely is it to happen. You can give that a ranking, or you can just say high, medium, or low, or not. None of those are essential. And this is where, Andy, who was our previous head of centres, had a particular view about this, which I found very refreshing. He said the problem with putting numbers against it and then doing that thing where you multiply the likelihood and the severity, and then you get a number between 1 and 25, is it provides a false veneer of science or objectivity to something that's actually quite subjective. So it's very easy to get tied up in that and going, oh, well, is it a 15 or is it a 25 or whatever? Whereas actually what you should be focusing on is, how do we control that risk? So if that thing works for you, by all means do it. If you've got people who feel that that's a helpful way to think about it, then you can do it, but it's absolutely not essential to put rankings and numbers and colour scales and all the rest of it. What is important is that you keep it under review. Go back to it every now and again, but particularly go back to it after any issues or near misses. And having a written risk assessment isn't any substitute for continuing to keep your eyes and ears open and continue to assess the risk dynamically as you go along, and adapt your approach if anything changes. Sometimes, I work predominantly with pioneers, and sometimes they're just bloody giddy. It's been wet playtime at school or whatever it is, and the activity that I have planned that in a normal week would be perfectly acceptable for a bunch of reasonably intelligent 10 to 12-year-olds to handle is just not going to be safe, or just not going to be sensible, or is going to lead to me completely losing my marbles by 7:30. So we do something different, and that's an example of keeping it under review and going, do you know what, we're going to change the plan. We're going to communicate the change of plan, and we're going to do something different to control the risk of the activity. Any questions, queries so far? Imka, I've seen your comment, and I will come back to it at the end because it's a bit of it's a particular example that I think is well worth diving into, but I'll run through the main content before I come back to that. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to query first? Otherwise, I shall press on. So to illustrate that point, about what's required, here is a classic example of the kind of likelihood and severity. what was the risk initially, then what do we do, and what's the risk now? And do you know what? This is how I've tended to do the risk assessments for my group. But I absolutely see Andy's point that there is a false veneer of science to that maybe is distracting. I think in colour, but maybe other people don't. And maybe it's distracting people's attention from the mitigation measures. So a much simpler way of expressing the same stuff is the template that we now have on the website, and it's also in the templates gallery on Google Docs if you're logged in with your Woodcraft email address. Just simply, what is the risk? Who's at risk from it? What are you going to do about it? And the column I would always include is who's responsible for making sure that happens. It's not the person, it's not the job of the person, and then maybe touches on Imka's point. It's not the job of the person who filled in the risk assessment to make sure that the risk assessment is always followed, because they might not even be there sometimes. So in your owner column, put who's responsible for making it happen. That might be an individual, that might be a named person, or it might be a role. It might be that you are in an in a group where there's somebody different allocated each week to run the session, lead the session, take the register, whatever. So if it's going to be Alex who does that every week, in the same way it's me who brings the keys and the folder every week, then put the name of the person. But if it's session leader, or the person who takes the register, or the person who buys the snack is the person responsible for making sure that it's not got nuts in it or whatever, then put whatever you call that role by, so that you know who on any given evening is the person responsible for that, and who and so that individual knows that that's an expectation on them. If you are leading the activity, it is your responsibility to make sure that the risks of it are explained to the elfins at the circle beforehand. So what's the risk? Who's at risk? What are you doing about it? And who owns the doing? Is the basic minimum that we need on a written risk assessment. And as I say, that can be generic to your normal activities in your normal venue, or if you're one of these groups that move between an indoor and an outdoor, just do two, indoor and outdoor, that cover the normal range of stuff that you do. So when you put it all into practice, minimize the complexity of the documentation. In an age-appropriate way, make sure you're involving the young people, certainly in understanding the things that you're doing to mitigate risk. We do this all the time. We've done it without thinking about it when you say, don't climb on the parachute with your shoes on or whatever. But involve the young people, not just in telling them what to do, but bearing in mind that point from the Girl Guides earlier. You're trying to encourage them to be able to think about the risk inherent in their activity and to think about themselves as part of the community. Involve them in identifying the risks and saying, well, what are we going to do about it? Maybe that discussion is different if you're talking to venturers and if you're talking to elfins. But elfins can, come up with sensible ground rules about how we make sure that we don't bang heads under the parachute. And it's empowering and it's learning for them to be involved in that. To kind of go back to the some of the principles of our wider safeguarding approach, informing the parents of the activities that we're doing and obtaining a level of informed consent from them. So not just, we're going to be doing a series of activities, but be explicit with them on your program or on your rota about what the activities are that you're going to be doing. A lot of the complaints from parents that come across my desk would have been solved if group leaders had been explicit before about what was going on at the session that week and enabled them to respond with queries and concerns in advance. And the queries and concerns could have been very easily put to bed, but it's trying to resolve them after the fact that's stressful for the adults involved, stressful for the parents and stressful for the children, and causes misunderstanding and bad feeling. So that principle of informed consent, not just I'm sending my child to Woodcraft, but I'm sending my child to Woodcraft where occasionally we might talk about these issues, those things that children might find upsetting or might trigger a further conversation in the family. Parents should know that that's what we're doing and what our group and what our practice is about. As I said, identifying who's accountable for making stuff happen and for looking after the things. Particularly when we're talking about our residential activities, but also, in our group activities and our group lives. Think about not just the activity that we've got planned, but also the transition from one to the other. Think about the downtime. Prime example, the camp I was on a few years ago, the serious injury, a serious break to a limb, happened not during the very carefully controlled and considered fire lighting activity or the big wide game where everyone was running around, but it happened after the activity had finished and before lunch was served, when the adults checked out of looking after the kids, and the kids all went up trees in the woods on the edge of the campsite. And that was when the child who was extremely experienced in climbing trees swarmed up to the top of it, and the child who was considerably less experienced in climbing trees swarmed up after him. Yeah. And that was when he fell. And nobody was supervising. If someone had been supervising, the dynamic risk assessment would have happened, and you would have gone now, maybe not any higher than that. But it was that point that it was an unplanned activity that had happened, that we weren't expecting and we hadn't thought about. I'm not saying you can plan for every eventuality, and I'm certainly not saying you shouldn't allow your children and young people any downtime, any unstructured social time. But you need to think about, even in that moment, after the activity is finished and before lunch is served, or between the end of the campfire and when they go to bed, who is keeping an eye on them? Who is watching for the risks? Who is making sure that the behaviour is appropriate? And that's particularly important when we're looking at residentials, although actually the bit between the activity finishing and the children being handed over to their loving parents, again, that's the time that things can sometimes go wrong, or it's unclear who is responsible for the child at that point. Have I handed them back to their parent yet? Was an example recently when we were doing lots of outdoor work because COVID, and it was still easier and safer to meet outdoors. There was an incident at one of the groups where parents would arrive to collect the children, and it was the park, and so somebody brought the dog because the dog needed a walk, and so in the moment between the activity finishing and link your hands and the parent being clearly responsible for the child, dog got off lead, bit another child. That's a classic example of a between time that was badly managed, and it wasn't very clear who was accountable for the children's safety at that point, and so on. The group then put in a much clearer set of guidelines saying, actually, if you're collecting your child, you wait behind the flower bed until we've finished, and then we'll bring the children over. And also, if you wouldn't mind keeping your dog on a lead, that would be grand. And that's exactly an example of reviewing and learning from the experience. Ideally, we learn from the near misses, or we learn from an observation rather than after an incident has taken place. But certainly when you have got a complaint, a concern, an injury or an incident, that's the time to go back. Not about apportioning blame, but it's about going, was this a freak that we couldn't have foreseen? Is it just one of those things? A child breaking an arm. Children break arms all the time. The question is, should we have done something different in order to ensure that that hadn't have happened? Was there something else that we could do? Should we, with the benefit of hindsight, done something different? And that's the time to tweak and update your risk assessment. Nobody's going to castigate volunteers for the unpredictable happening. Where we will be concerned is if that stuff has happened and you have not reflected on it and learned from it and decided to put something in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's the important part of our process. That's more or less everything I had to say on risk assessment. The other thing that's been updated recently, and this is again in response to lots of queries about what do we need to do, is a thing about first aid cover. Now, this is not exactly part of your risk assessment because you're trying to minimise the risk of things happening in the first place. But first aid is a key way that we reduce the severity if something does go wrong. People often ask, do we have to have a first aider at every session? You don't necessarily. What you need to have done, much like you need to have done a risk assessment, is you need to have considered what you need in place to manage the likely outcomes in terms of young people or adult volunteers injuring themselves. You don't have to have a first aid, a qualified first aider at every activity. If you're doing low risk activities in your church hall, your normal meeting venue, in a built up area where at least in theory you ought to be able to rely on calling an ambulance quickly in an emergency, you don't have to have somebody who is qualified to the level that you would be in a factory or a mine in order to manage that risk effectively. What you do need, the bare minimum, is an appointed person, so that if there is an accident or an injury, you know who is the person who is responsible for giving the first aid whilst everyone else manages the impact on everybody else. Who is the person? And that's what they call in the legislation an appointed person. That's the minimum you need in place. You can do appointed person courses offered by St Anne's Ambulance and Red Cross and people like that, but they're not required. An appointed person is merely that, a named individual. If you're in a more remote location, or if you're doing more complicated or risky activities, you might decide that it's necessary to have somebody who's qualified to that emergency first aid at work, that emergency basic life support level or equivalent. And particularly for a longer or a more remote activity, then you might want that higher level of the first aid at work qualification or equivalent. Or indeed, if you're doing long distance walking or particularly adventurous activities, you might want something specialist. So you can get specialist pediatric sports qualifications, you can get specialist mountain leader qualifications and appropriate first aid cover for that. It's your job as the volunteers who are running the activity and considering how to make it safe to go through that process. And it's always worth a simple piece of documentation, which you can either add into your safeguarding plan or add on to the end of your risk assessment or have as a standalone document. And this is the template that exists in our guidance, which says what level of cover, who are the people, how many have we decided we need, ideally, who are they, and what are the resources. And again, if you look at the guidance that Grace has very helpfully put the link to in the chat, but also you can find using that craf.org.uk/first aid. There is a list of what the approved first aid kits should contain. Again, that's a minimum. I mean, they are very heavy on the dressings and bandages and iPads and all of those sorts of things, not iPads, bandages, all of those sorts of things. And if you stick that, first aid kit BS 8599 into any well-known e-commerce website, you will find approved first aid kits. In practical terms, you're going to want to add some more stuff to it if you're going away for a week's camp or whatever, to make sure you've got the things that you will need to support young people being away from home. That might be, it might be Calpol painkillers, it might be sanitary towels, it might be whatever. Don't rely wholly on that first aid kit being suitable for every eventuality, but update it and add to it in the light of your experience. And again, that should be part of the consent to offer first aid, or indeed offer painkillers or something in the event of them being needed. Should be part of the consent that you're taking from your parents and carers before you take away unaccompanied young people. So that's absolutely something to think about. But the first aid guidance goes into quite a lot of detail about that, as well as where to get training from and the different sorts of providers are out there. So particularly before taking a residential away, it's really worth having a look at that and making sure you're applying it to your setting. Just finally, the HSE, again, they get a bad rep, but they are a very good source of both the definitive legal answers for a lot of this stuff, but also of common sense advice and proportional advice. If you're thinking about camps and residentials, then the Outdoor Education Advisors Panel, which is an organisation that Andy Taylor was very closely involved in, have got lots of guidance specific to that camping and residential and outdoor ed sphere. The Nothing Ventured booklet that I mentioned earlier is also available from that English Outdoor Council. The other thing I should have put on here actually is the Safeguarding Hub resources produced by the National Youth Agency. They are both an advisory body and a regulator of youth work activities in England and Wales. They've recently launched a very good sort of training and resource and template hub looking at every aspect of safeguarding and risk assessment. And if you're looking for another perspective from outside of our organisation, thank you, Grace, the Safeguarding and Risk Management Hub is a really good resource. There's lots of stuff in there that it's predominantly written with an audience of professional youth workers in mind, but particularly people working with pioneer and venturer groups, as well as those supporting DF groups. There's lots of very useful stuff that might help when you're experiencing things that are slightly outside the normal. Lots of stuff around alcohol, drugs, child sexual exploitation, county lines, all of those things that we should all be aware of, even if they're not a routine part of our experience with working with young people. It's a really good resource to go to for another external perspective. That was everything I had. I'm very happy to respond to questions or open the discussion up. And if necessary, Imka, I can pick up on your particular queries either later on or right now. Felix, you've finished giving tea. Anything you wanted to add?
Thank you. I followed that, and whilst giving my children tea, so I'm quite pleased I got through it. I just wanted to bring up a few comments, if that's okay. I'll be brief because I appreciate time is precious. So in my role as head of centres, I think it's important just to point out that any activity that's delivered in one of our centres is already risk assessed. But that doesn't mean that you don't have an interest in helping manage that risk. It just means that we have done a lot of due diligence. And what we find in the centres is that the activities themselves are not necessarily the ones where people find themselves being injured. It's things around the activities that are problematic. For example, some of the behavioural issues with young people as they're approaching an activity when they're not concentrating. Those kind of things can have quite a serious impact on how things happen, and that might present a trip accident, or someone's not been listening to instruction. And I think what we encourage quite a lot in the education sector, residential sector, is this idea of partnership working. So the attendant adult, the adult who's responsible for the group, works with the instructor, and together they sort of come to an understanding about what the group's needs are, and they're able to have those conversations about young people who may have particular concentration concerns or attitudes around learning that might need to be picked up, those type of things. They can be really, really helpful in setting out how an activity can take place. And just understanding that a lot of these things are around observation. So going into a situation and just being open to what could be a risk is really, really, really useful. I think it's really important also to consider the mental health risks associated with young people, particularly today. Now, I'm not familiar with any hard and fast things that Woodcraft do around managing mental health, and I certainly don't want to create any concerns here, but I think it's really important that we start to understand that we do have this responsibility to look after young people's mental health as well as physical health as well. In centres, you'll be reassured to know that we are quite rigorous in how we report and assess those kinds of incidents that happen. And we are really good at working with people to help them understand risk assessments in our environments and in other people's environments as well. So what I'd like to say to anybody in a Woodcraft group, a volunteer, if they're really stuck for somewhere to turn to, they're more than welcome to turn to any of our centres and seek some advice from our centres. They're quite experienced in this area. So we're available to help. That's an offer, really. Just as a quick anecdote, I used to run a residential centre, and it was an old Jacobean mansion with very heavy oak floors. We had two groups of schools, two school groups every year that would come to this residential centre. And for some reason, our accident report book would always contain crushed finger injuries from these doors, and we couldn't work out why. So we assessed what was going on, and it turned out that the schools that were coming had those door protectors back at school. Recognizing that point, if you take away risk, you kind of get people used to having accidents. So it's just an interesting side note there. And one final point, I'm duty bound to say this, as a director for Council for Learning Outside of the Classroom, I would strongly encourage anybody, as well as those links that Owen's provided and that Grace has provided, if you're interested in learning outside the classroom, kind of procedures and support and resources, that's a great resource to look at. And indeed, Andy, my predecessor, has gone on to work for the Council for Learning Outside the Classroom. So of course, it's a great organisation. Thank you, Owen. I thought it was a really, really comprehensive overview.
Cool. Thank you, Felix. I just want to pick up on one thing that you mentioned, because I think it's particularly pertinent to some of the stuff that we're dealing with as group leaders, about that sort of the risks that come from children not listening and maybe not understanding the instructions. And one of the strengths of our model is the extent to which we are inclusive, and we're working with a diverse group of young people with diverse needs. And one of the key ways that we keep young people safe, safe from harm and safe from incident, is through having that understanding and that relationship with them. That means that we know that actually there's no point asking Carrie to take in the information from the warden's talk, and it has to be put into a social story or whatever. I think our volunteers are by and large very good at that, and particularly good at understanding and adapting to the individual needs of the children that we know about. I think one of the things that I've noticed is that when you first send out a health form, when they're first coming to your groups, you might not get full disclosure of everything that we know and that the parent might know and understand about that group, about that child. And it's always, I will never rely on the information about health conditions or additional needs that I have for a group night. When I'm taking them away for the weekend, I will always send out a new health form. And you know what? I'm bloody glad I did, because I was just about to disappear off to Lockabrook in February a few years ago. And I sent out the health form and suddenly discovered, when it was returned, that one of the children in the group had sickle cell disease, which hadn't previously been disclosed to us because his mum didn't think it was relevant for a half an hour running around in a church hall for whatever reason. But I'm bloody glad she told us before we took him halfway up a mountain in February. That's really good to know that one. And we were able to adapt, and we were able to include it on a risk. You know, sometimes you will have individual children identified on your risk assessment. You know, that's perfectly fine. Sometimes people are very, concerned about, confidentiality and keeping information about individual children, which is absolutely right, that we should be sharing information on a need-to-know basis. And if we need to say child X must not get cold on a walk because it will send them into sickle cell crisis, to take an example at random, everybody who's going to be responsible for that child on a walk, or could be responsible for that child on a walk, needs to know that. And there's no trouble with sharing that among the group of leaders that will be accompanying that activity. Right. Imka had some specific queries about group health and safety leads and things like that, which I will just try and cover now.
Owen, would you like me to stop recording if it's something quite specific?
Not necessarily, and it's, nothing, none of this is confidential. You may or may not wish to edit it out or put it in something that's a little bit more on the theme. Let's not look at the draft. Let's look at the actual the actual document. So we were having a conversation, just for background for everybody else. We were having a conversation this morning over email around health and safety leads and safeguarding leads. In the vast majority of groups, we expect that it will be the same person doing both jobs because they are inextricably linked. If you have two different people doing that job, that's great, because two heads better than one, all of that, and it's good to have a check and a balance. But one person is taking more of a safeguarding view, and one person's taking a accident and injury management view. But we were asked by our insurers to identify the named individuals responsible in each of our groups as a condition of our insurance. They are perfectly comfortable with that group having the same named health and safety and safeguarding lead. As for the question about where it's identified what those individuals are responsible for doing, in both cases, the roles and responsibilities are identified really clearly in the health and safety policy and in the safeguarding policy. We go through, there's a session for newly appointed safeguarding leads that we do every now and again, which goes through in detail what you're expected to do and what your accountabilities are. You can certainly do one aimed at group health and safety leads where those are different individuals. Just bear with me a second. So if I go to the health and safety and wellbeing, I'm just going to share my screen a second. Health and safety and wellbeing policy on the website. Download. It was updated as recently as December 2022, but it didn't significantly change. And there at the bottom of page 5 is what health and safety leads are responsible for doing. As we were sort of saying earlier, it's not the health and safety lead will do it all so that nobody ever has to think about health and safety. Their role is effectively to keep it on the agenda, to make sure that everybody knows what's expected of them, to support training locally as required, to be a first point of contact with someone who's concerned, and make sure that the reporting is done. The lead health and safety officer, which is Felix, and to seek advice or contact the lead officer if advice or assistance is required. Felix is always contactable through the safeguarding@ email address, as well as by his own felix@woodcraft.org.uk. If you send in a query to that safeguarding@ email address, it will always be picked up by somebody within a working day at the outmost, and we will, in the normal run of things, determine which of us is best placed to respond, whether it's a primarily safeguarding or a primarily health and safety related query, or whether it's something we can refer you to guidance on very, very quickly. So that's the generalities. Imka, does that help? I'll come back to the specific scenario that you mentioned earlier, but has that helped with the wider picture?
No.
No?
Because we had the meeting and there was a real angst about taking on this role because nobody actually understands it. So
Right.
what I basically get is that the health and safety person literally just needs to make sure that we look at the risks, basically keep it on the agenda, and
Yeah.
if there's anything happening, they would be the first point of contact. But
Yeah,
they
so
are not physically responsible for all the health and safety. And I think that's something.
So as with a local safeguarding lead, you're not saying you are the only person who will ever have a safeguarding head on, because we're all sharing responsibility for the safety and well-being and safeguarding of children and young people all the time. That's what you accept by being in the room when we're doing Woodcraft. They are the people who make sure that stuff is being thought about, that are, if you like, a critical friend to the group leader, to the group coordinator, and to people running the activities, going, you know, just make sure we're thinking about the safeguarding aspects of that, and a point of contact, particularly, you know, in most groups, the culture is quite open, people will share concerns, but if there's a particular concern about a particular child, or a particular concern about the behaviour of an adult that's not appropriate to share widely, the safeguarding lead will be the first point of contact, and will be they're the people with whom I have the closest relationship in the groups, because they're the ones who phone me up and say, Owen, I just want to talk about a scenario that happened at our group the other night. And very often we just discuss the situation, and I and large confirm that their instincts are sound, or will sometimes agree that it's worth making a referral or something to someone else, to an external agency. All that the health and safety lead for a group is doing, if it is a different person, is doing that job of being a point of contact, someone to report things to, so that someone has the overview. You know, if you have a different group of people leading your group each week, and the same thing almost happens 3 weeks running, but it's being led by a different person, and so therefore the pieces aren't put together, then that's an issue for us. The reason that we would have an appointed local health and safety lead, whether they're at the session or not, if there's an incident or a near miss, you need to make sure that it's being reported to a health and safety lead, and therefore they would notice that the same thing is happening time and time again, or nearly happening time and time again, and they would therefore at your next planning meeting be able to go, hey guys, maybe we should do something about that massive stack of chairs in the corner that keeps almost falling on the children. It's at that level of, you know, somebody to have an overview.
Yeah,
rather
thanks.
than
That's,
everybody thinking that they've done their bit just by going, oh well, it's fine, it didn't happen. Does that make sense?
yes, Owen, I think that makes really sense, and that's really clear, and I will feed that back to my group, because that will take hopefully some of the angst off.
I mean, frankly, if you've put your hand up to be a local safeguarding lead, then adding the health and safety element to it is not a significantly onerous additional responsibility in my book. And that's why in the vast majority of places we would be, you know, people would be doubling up on those roles. It's only that sometimes people have found it helpful to broaden it to have a slightly larger group of people working together and holding each other to account, or share the responsibility around slightly more equitably. But those two are very, very closely intertwined. So effectively what you have is two people working very, very closely together if you do identify two different people. But it is, yeah, it's literally just a case of making sure it's on the agenda and making sure that reporting is being done, making sure that people know where to go, being the person who reminds people that, you know, there is the risk assessment. Oh, it's been 12 months since we looked at it. Can we look at it at the next planning meeting? If that doesn't already happen, if that's not already baked into the way that you work. So sorry, I was just looking for the chat window because I know you had something that you said was a specific scenario, but I've lost the chat window now, so I can't find it.
Owen, that's fine. I think you've answered it. The question
Right.
was if there's a risk assessment and the leader doesn't follow the risk assessment, something happens, who is responsible? And then the same, the leader follows everything and something still happens. Well, I think it's just, we need to take it as it comes, because you can just only take so many risks and try and prevent them, any accidents, as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, as Felix said, if you've got risk assessments that you're not comfortable that they're up to scratch, you know, we're always happy to take a look and advise or say, you know, have you thought about this or whatever. I think in that particular, you know, in that particular scenario, the health and safety lead is not the person with whom the buck stops about everything. The person leading any activity needs to make sure that they're doing it in accordance with all of our requirements and guidance, and that includes following the risk assessment that's been written. But those around them are also responsible for supporting them by challenging them if they see them doing something obviously stupid and dangerous. You know, sometimes the cooperative and collaborative nature of the organisation is slightly at odds with the way we might need to write things down to make roles and responsibilities crystal clear in a policy. There will be accountabilities resting on named individuals, but that doesn't mean that in a cooperative organisation we shouldn't be always acting as a support and a critical friend to those around us in order to make our provision as effective, as cooperative, as collaborative and successful as it can be. Did anyone else have anything else they wanted to query, raise, suggest, disagree with? I can't hear you, Bob.
No, that's done itself for some reason. Turned itself off. It's something I said. Yeah, thanks very much. That was a useful kind of recap of a lot of things. One or two stood out. The thing about revising your
Oh, you froze me, Bob.
Oh, have I? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, Aaron.
You said the thing about revising risk assessments. He's frozen again.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's particularly a related thing is when you got new people turning up. We had an incident with that, yeah. And you know, you tend to forget. You know, I mainly deal with venturers, and they're all pretty sensible and know a lot of stuff. But you get new people coming into the group, and you have to really actively remember that they need to know some things that all the rest of the gang already know, probably.
Yes,
Um,
and it can be tricky when you're working with, most of our venturers have been in it, since they were elfins. And it can be quite a challenge sometimes when you've got, when venturers bring their friends along, which they occasionally do, to just keep reminding yourself that actually they didn't necessarily, learn these things from being knee-high to a grasshopper. I've certainly had that experience of having to go, no, to a 15-year-old. This is how you look a Van Gogh. All the ones that I've
it's
known,
not how we do it.
it's second nature. And it's doubly true when when we've got new volunteers supporting our groups, because sometimes they have learned different ways and different habits that just don't that are not. We need to be very careful of going, well, this is the way we do it, and therefore everyone knows that that's the way to do it. Having a risk assessment where it's all written down and having a safeguarding plan where it's all written down is important.
Can you hear, is my internet okay? Is it? Can you hear me?
All right. Sorry, was I talking over you? Oh, no, it's really hit and miss, isn't it?
Okay. By topic.
Oh no, Bob, I think we've
Yeah, sorry, lost it now. But thanks very much anyway. That was good.
You're welcome.
Great. You're very welcome, Bob.
Yeah.
Right.
So-
Okay.
Okay.
Great. If there's nothing else, we'll stop there. Brilliant. Thank you both.
Bye.
Good night, Felix. Thanks.